Okay. Honorable members of the European Parliament, dear speakers, dear ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's webinar, where we will be specifically addressing EPR as a policy instrument to tackle microplastics pollution. Just to let you know that this event comes following up on our first webinar held in January, which was aimed at problem setting, so understanding of microplastics and potential measures to address the issue. Before we kick off, I would like to take the opportunity to thank hosting MEP Mr. Franc Bogovič for once again taking the lead with regards to the organization and hosting today's event, but also colleagues from the EPR Club for co-organizing this event. Before passing the floor to Mr. Danko Aleksic, Project Manager of the Association of Cities and Regions for Sustainable Resource Management, for our first event wrap-up, I would also like to invite our audience to send us your questions during the event. For that, you can specifically use the Q&As box, which should appear at the right of your screen, choosing the All Panelists option. So you can use for your questions the Q&As box via choosing the All Panelists option. Within your questions, please also make sure to indicate the speaker to whom your question is best addressed, so that we can facilitate a fruitful discussion to follow. So once again, on this note, thank you very much for joining us today. Mr. Aleksic, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gampas. Distinguished speakers and participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure and privilege to address you at the beginning of the second part of the EPR Club conference. My name is Danko Aleksic, and I work as project manager in the ACR Plus, which stands for Association of Cities and Regions for Sustainable Resource Management. ACR Plus is an international network of cities and regions sharing the aim of promoting a sustainable resource management and accelerating the transition towards a circular economy on their territories and beyond. Also, ACR Plus acts as a secretariat of the EPR Club. The EPR Club was founded in 2012 on an initiative of ACR Plus together with some of its members and with the support of the European Commission. EPR Club is a unique European think tank on EPR, gathering a variety of stakeholders from all concerned areas, aiming to be a platform for sharing points of view, opinions, and good practices in order to strengthen a dialogue on EU policy developments and technical implementation of EPR schemes throughout Europe. As we are all aware, very large quantities of plastic waste leak into the environment from various sources. Microplastic, defined as fragments of plastics below 5 millimeters in size, is a source of plastic leakage, posing additional potential threats both to the environment and human health. In order to discuss the growing issue of microplastics, the EPR Club, in collaboration with the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, undertook efforts to organize an international conference entitled EPR as an Instrument to Tackle Microplastics Pollution, composed of 2 webinars. The event was initiated by the EPR Club members, ACR Plus, DSD, and Suez, together with EURO. The first webinar took place less than a month ago on 27th of January, and it was aimed towards problem setting, understanding of microplastics and potential measures to address it. At this point, I will try to provide a quick recap on the main elements discussed at the first webinar and its main conclusions. In his opening remarks, host of the event, a member of European Parliament, Mr. Franc Bogovič, stressed that plastics have become an important source of global environmental damage, especially because of the fact that most plastics are single-use and non-biodegradable, and that only 9% of all plastics ever produced have been recycled. He also underlined that international determination is growing more and more to tackle this issue. In her introductory remarks, Ms. Rosalina Petrova, member of Cabinet of Commissioner on Environment, Oceans and Fisheries, highlighted that it is important to see how we could expand the EPR as instrument to ensure proper management of plastic waste and to stimulate the production of more sustainable products. She also stressed the need for reliable scientific data on plastics and microplastics, as well as the importance of international cooperation. Plastic pollution has to be treated on the global level, while the EU should give an example. In his keynote remarks, Mr. Jürgen Bertling from Fraunhofer Institute stressed the fact that the problem of microplastics is not something which is happening far away. It is a European challenge as well. He also proposed that biodegradability should be used as benchmark, not the size of the particles, and he indicated that tire wear is the most important source of microplastics emissions. In her presentation, Ms. Fazilet Tsinaralap, Secretary General of the European Tire and Rubber Manufacturers Association, underlined that the tire industry continues to study effects and impacts of tire and road wear particles on the environment. She stressed that reducing tire and road wear particles is a very complex issue, which requires comprehensive and balanced multi-sectoral approach, having in mind that levels of these particles depend on many factors. So not only the tire characteristics, but also driving behavior, weather conditions, road conditions, and vehicle characteristics. Through his presentation, Mr. Anders Finnsson, Senior Environmental Advisor in Swedish Waters, representing Euro, made the participants familiar with results of research undertaken in 2 wastewater treatment plants in Sweden, so one in Gothenburg and one in Malmö. In both cases, almost 99% of microplastics were removed from incoming wastewaters. Therefore, he stressed that pushing for additional removal requirements wouldn't be reasonable, as wastewater treatment plants are already very efficient, but more source control system is needed. He especially highlighted the fact that microplastics pathways to water recipients from storm waters are 100 times greater than from effluent wastewater, and therefore he stressed that more source control systems need to be put in place to monitor this and to hold polluters accountable through EPR initiatives. Finally, in his closing remarks, host of the event, Member of European Parliament, Mr. Bogovič, welcomed the panel's overall consensus on the need for cross-sector collaboration and the need for having a holistic approach on tackling microplastics pollution. Let me remind those of you who are more interested in the first event that the recording of the first event and also all presentations given during it are available on the EPR Club website. The second webinar, which has just begun, will be focused on EPR as a policy instrument. On behalf of organizers, I'm using this opportunity to thank all of you for registering for participation in this event, and I'm inviting you to take part in it through posing questions to our speakers. And finally, also on behalf of organizers, I would like to thank Mr. Bogovič for his interest in the topic and for his willingness to host these 2 webinars. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danko, on behalf of the Secretariat of your intergroup for your key summary with regards to the first event, which took place in late January. Also, thank you very much for stressing the need for a science policy nexus, which has been the main mission of this European Parliament intergroup since its first establishment in 1994, but also the need for a leading role of the EU within a multi-stakeholder international approach. On this note, I would also like to provide the floor at this stage to Mr. Bogovič, hosting MEP of this event. Mr. Franc Bogovič is a member of the European Parliament for the group of EPP. Prior to that, he was elected member of the National Parliament of the Republic of Slovenia 2 consecutive times, and also held the position of Minister for Agriculture and Environment in the 10th government of the Republic of Slovenia. So as the key MEP, but also as an ex-minister for agriculture and environment, Mr. Bogovič, your experience and key expertise as well are very much appreciated. So thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elias. Thank you for these kind words. Good afternoon, dear panelists, dear participants, dear colleague Stelios, who is also with us today. Welcome on this second part of the webinar about extended producer responsibility as an instrument to tackle microplastic pollution. As we heard during the first part of the webinar, we were discussing the origins of microplastic and legislative and practical measures for addressing its impact on the environment. Today, we will focus on extended producer responsibility as policy instrument in order to stimulate the production of more sustainable products. Plastics have been useful for society for a long time, but also have negative impacts that need to be addressed properly. Within the EU, a variety of regulatory and legislative tools exist aimed at controlling, reducing, and managing the use of plastic, especially on single-use plastics. Existing legislation consists mainly of levies, bans, and voluntary efforts through the rule reduce, reuse, and recycle. The Single-Use Plastic Directive, which is expected to be successfully implemented this year, is one of the examples of such legislative measures, while the extended producer responsibility requires ensure that proper waste management of plastic and are expected to stimulate the production of more sustainable products. However, this regulatory instrument have had a limited impact in volume scope, especially when considering the exponential yearly increase in production and use of plastic, including the growing synthesis of new materials with new applications. As it has been discussed during our first webinar, the need for cross-sector collaboration and the need for having a holistic approach on tackling microplastic pollution is urgent, as well as the need for development of best practices prior to legislation. The issue of tire and road wear particles, which was presented during our webinar, is, in my opinion, a great example of how external factors impacts the level of pollution with microplastic. External factors such as driving behavior, weather condition, and vehicle characteristic greatly influence these levels, which shows that challenge needs to be tackled through a holistic, multi-sectoral approach. Therefore, further measures in addressing the sustainability changes of plastic and to improve waste management are needed, including raising awareness, improper plastic waste management, innovative eco-design measures, and labeling standards. Reliable scientific data on plastic and microplastic are also needed in order to help innovation and technological development. I am confident that today's webinar will provide us with some of the answers on how EPR can become an effective tool in tackling microplastic pollution. So I would like to give the floor to Mr. Michael Sponer, Deputy Head of Unit on Marine Environment and Water Industry in DG Environment in the European Commission. I wish nice afternoon to everybody, and Mr. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm impressed by the number of people who are interested in EPR for microplastic. This is really encouraging because it's not an easy issue, and it creates a lot of attention, and that's really good. I'm, as you were mentioning, deputy head of a unit in charge of marine environment. But before joining this unit, I was working in the waste unit and working particularly on the Waste Framework Directive and particularly on EPR and the new requirements which are now embedded is the Waste Framework Directive. So, in fact, I am, you know, I have moved from the waste domain to the marine environment domain, and we have worked a lot, obviously, on marine litter. I will try to show you some slides now, which are coming from different studies that we have launched on microplastics specifically. Well, first of all, I would like to mention that the issue of microplastic receives a lot of attention inside the Commission. In fact, inside the European Green Deal, there are different initiatives, whether on circular economy or the forthcoming initiative on zero pollution. And microplastics is regularly mentioned as an issue that we have to tackle and to use a principle of precautionary principle to try to reduce them as much as we can in different level of the cycle of microplastics. But it's mentioned in several papers, and it was already mentioned during, well, with the previous commission under the plastic strategy, where different actions were already mentioned also to reduce microplastics. If very concretely we try to see what are the main source of microplastics, we have tried to make this assessment and try to make a quantification of the different sources. You can see from these graphics that in fact there are ranges and that there are a lot of uncertainties around what is found in the environment and what is released in the environment. But probably our estimates are showing that automotive tires are the first source of microplastics in the environment, followed by plastic pellets coming from industry, from different type of industry of the plastics production. And then you have textiles and paints and different other sources. In fact, in this graphic, you can show that this is unintentionally added microplastics. So they are not coming directly from a product. They are not included in a product, but they come from the degradation of this product, of the tires, but they are coming from the losses of plastic pellets, but it's not intentional. And then you have some sources which are intentional, so microplastics which are intentionally added in certain type of products. And you can see here the share, you have fertilizer, paints, and also cosmetics. But probably, but according to our estimates, the most important sources are coming from non-intentionally added microplastics. So what are we doing in the Commission to tackle these issues? And this was already announced in the plastic strategy, but now different colleagues are working hard to make it happen. It takes time because it's complex fields, but we are working at source. And probably the first thing that will be concretely on the table in the coming weeks is a restriction for the intentionally added microplastics in cosmetic detergent paints, but also for oxoplastics. There will be a general ban, which will be taken under the REACH regime. And our colleagues working on the REACH regulation are finalizing this ban and this general restriction. So that's one concrete things which will come first. Then on tire and textile, there are different initiatives going on, and there will be different impact assessment to try to see and to see whether different options, what they could deliver. And there we are speaking about, first of all, harmonization of the measurement method. It was mentioned during the previous seminar, but one of the barriers is the fact that we don't have harmonized method to calculate and to estimate what are the release of microplastics from different sources, and it's particularly the case for tires and textile. Then amongst the options which will be analyzed in this impact assessment, we will certainly discuss about the possibility of labeling. So knowing, okay, you buy a tire, what would be its millages, or what would be a standard loss which could be expected. Probably also we will discuss minimum requirements, for instance, for textile, to remove from the market those textile emitting a lot of microplastics. And probably we will also analyze different options for integration. For instance, on the textile, well, one could think about improved washing machine. Yes, but if we improve the washing machine with different filters, then what are we going to do with these filters? If these filters are washed again through water, they will go back into the water. So we will not earn anything there. So this is different options that we will think of and which will be developed in an impact assessment, which is launched these days by our colleagues in charge of this strategy. In addition, on plastic pellets, we are discussing, and it's other colleagues also discussing different possibilities. On one side, to have a chain approach, so to try to reduce plastic losses in different stages of the chain between the production of these plastic pellets until their use at the final user level, and also probably permitting for the big facilities making these pellets on the market. There is a review of the Industrial Emission Directive which is going on, in which this problem will be also analyzed. So that's a different action which are going on to try to reduce this release at source, which remained a priority for the Commission. When these microplastics are in the water, particularly, there are different pathways. And part of them are in the wastewater. Let's think about textile mainly, are taken by urban, which are those water which are partly collected and driven to the wastewater treatment plants, but partly not. And this stormwater and urban runoff, there you will find a mix of different microplastics, but tires will be certainly present. And it's the same case for non-collected wastewater outside the system of collection of wastewater, collection and treatment of wastewater. And these ones are particularly from tires that are directly going into the environment. When they are in the wastewater treatment plants, there is another issue which is relatively clear, is that, okay, it depends on the level of treatment. It's clear that if the wastewater treatment is as different step of treatment going to the most advanced treatment, a lot of these microplastic are captured and processed in the wastewater treatment plants. But if you have a simple treatment, only primary treatment, then these microplastics are not well captured. So the range of capture depends on the level of treatment. And there is another additional thinking, which is a little bit, which make the think a little bit more complex, is that part of these microplastics, and an important part, will land into the sludge coming from the wastewater treatment plants, and then it depends on the fate of this sludge. Obviously, if they are either landfill, but landfill, you know, or burned, then part of this problem will disappear. But if they are used in agriculture, they will go back to the environment and they will be present in the soil. I would like to illustrate you this with a study which was published in 2008 by the Norwegian Institute on the presence of microplastics on land and on soil. Most of the wastewater treatment plants are sending their sludge in agriculture in Norway. And you can see from the assessment that around 7 billion particles, microplastics particles per day are sent to the soil, which is probably an excessive estimation. I would like to mention that we are reviewing now the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, and we will try to make an estimate for the European Union based on the most recent data that we receive from different sources, and probably will have something which is a little bit less important, but knowing still that 60% of the sludge are used in agriculture in the European Union. So this is a problem that we cannot simply hide or make as if it doesn't exist. We have to really analyze the full chain from the production to their fate at the end of the chain, because otherwise we will not have a solution which are fits for the purpose. So when we speak about EPR, there are different challenges if we want to imagine a EPR scheme for microplastics. And I think that it's absolutely important to discuss the feasibility of such a system, but also the acceptability, not only by the stakeholder, but also by the member states and also by the general public. the difficulties are related to some important steps that we need for designing an EPR scheme. Well, first we need to quantify what is placed on the market. And from that, we have to quantify what is released in the environment, which is not obvious at all. I've shown you in the first slide that the quantification, we are able to have margins, but we don't know precisely what is released in the environment. Probably on what is placed on the market, we can have good statistics and have good information on that. But the challenge is to translate that into what is released in the different pathway in the environment. Then another layer of complication is to identify the cost. Who is paying for the treatment of these microplastics when they are released in the environment? And that is complex because today, in fact, these microplastics, when they are captured in the wastewater treatment plants, the only problem is that if they go in the sludge, and this sludge is used in agriculture, we might have additional cost to remove this microplastic from the sludge. But inside the wastewater treatment plants themselves, there is not so much additional cost today as when they are captured by the wastewater treatment system. What could happen in the future, and our intention for the review of the urban wastewater treatment plan is to it's to better capture these microplastics through a better management of the stormwater overflows, but also of urban runoff. But I must be honest, I mean, the objective of better capturing this pollution coming from stormwater overflows and urban runoff, the main driver would be the classical pollution. So capturing more microplastics will be another side effect, another benefits that we can hope with a better capture of these stormwater overflows and urban runoff, but it will be difficult to really allocate this additional cost to only the microplastic sector. So this is a different challenge. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I think that we still need to work on it. And by the way, in the context of the impact assessment that we are leading now on the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, we will discuss all these aspects in the impact assessment and go a little bit more in depth and try to quantify and make some calculation on what might be an EPR scheme, and then decide whether it's feasible and acceptable or not based on the evidence that we'll be able to gather. So in conclusion, I think that we have to insist that the priority for the Commission is action at source. It's better to try to avoid as much as possible microplastics before they are released in the environment. But we are convinced that even if we take a lot of measures at source, there will be remaining paths through water, and urban wastewater treatment might be, collection and treatment might be is already a good path to capture these microplastics, even if it's an end of pipe solution. So it will help, and in the review we intend to increase our requirements for better management of stormwater overflows and urban runoff. We need to find additional solution because and notably EPR might be a good solution because today we cannot put all the prices on the water price. And also the availability of the budget for wastewater treatment and collection is limited. So we have to be imaginative and creative and try to send the bill back to those placing products on the market, which are creating additional cost for the water treatment. Certainly EPR is a promising avenue. I'm not sure that for microplastics we have enough information today, but it's to be discussed and it will be a part of our debate. But certainly we are thinking about EPR in a broader way and trying to also consider other type of pollutants. I think maybe in this review, if we manage to have already an EPR scheme for other type of micropollution, that might be a first step, opening the path for additional step for the microplastics. And with that, thank you to all of you, and I'm ready and prepared and happy to answer to any question if you have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sponer, for your keynote intervention, underlining the significant actions and the relevant measures that the European Commission is currently working on. I'm sure it really served to stimulate a discussion to follow with our audience. Moving on, and I also think that the amount of 6.8 billion microplastics released per day It's very alarming, and at the same time serves to highlight the timely nature of today's discussion. So on this note, I'd like to provide the floor to Ms. Elena Boutsi. Ms. Boutsi is a junior policy analyst at the Environment Directorate of OECD, which stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And specifically, Ms. Boutsi leads the work on microplastics, which is placed at the interface between the OECD work on plastics and circular economy, and also the work on water quality. So specifically the nexus that we're addressing today. The ongoing project also aims to deliver policy guidance to OECD countries on how to reduce microplastics pollution, with a focus on microplastics unintentionally released from textiles, but also tires. So Ms. Boutsi, thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. Could I just confirm that you can see my slides, please?
Yes, it's starting to share the content. We cannot see it at this stage, but yes, we can now. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So the plan for my intervention is that I will present some key findings from our work on microplastics mitigation, and then focus on the relevance and potential of EPR to address microplastics pollution. Let me say that the OECD has not done yet any specific work on EPR for micropollutants. So the intention is really to draw from our past and ongoing work to inform our discussion today. Let me also mention that my colleague, Martin Dubois, who leads projects related to plastics and the circular economy at the OECD, and also has extensive expertise on EPR, has also joined me today at this meeting. So as we saw during the first part of this conference, microplastics pollution is an emerging reason of concern. And it also presents a complex challenge for policymakers who are trying to address this issue. Firstly, because microplastics come from a wide variety of sources, but also because they enter the environment through several pathways. As we saw, one pathway are wastewater networks, and their wastewater treatment plants are already largely effective, at least in Europe, at retaining microplastics. However, even a 5 to 10% share of microplastics which are not retained during treatment could result in high amounts of microplastics being released to water bodies. And on the other hand, we know that even if we improve treatment, we still have the issue of having to handle sludge, which is more contaminated with microplastics, and we still need to understand the fate and impacts of microplastics in soil. Secondly, many types of microplastics enter the environment through diffuse pathways, mainly transport by wind, road runoff, and stormwater. And there are very few barriers. The majority of microplastics are expected to enter the environment. So our work at the OECD specifically focused on unintentional releases of microplastics emitted from textiles and tires. And the reason for that was that we realized that these constitute a significant share of total releases to the environment, but currently they are largely untargeted by the current policy frameworks in OECD countries. And also there is a growing interest in several member countries of the OECD to address this emerging issue. So a key message that we got from our work is that since emissions of microplastics occur and are influenced by all stages of the life cycle of products, there are several available entry points to mitigate emissions. Several best practices at the level of design, manufacturing, and use have been identified to essentially reduce the tendency of products to contribute to microplastics pollution. A number of emerging technological solutions also exist and can be employed to mitigate releases. This is the case, for instance, of filters for washing machines. At the end of life, it will always be relevant to ensure that end-of-life garments and tires are managed in a sound way. which also does not lead to higher releases of microplastics. And lastly, even if we take measures upstream, we know that it's likely that some end-of-pipe capture will also be needed, either at the level of wastewater treatment or stormwater treatment, or both. So essentially, due to the nature of the problem, we realized, or it became evident, that a life cycle approach will be needed, although action upstream is likely to have the largest mitigation potential. This is especially the case for diffuse sources of microplastics, such as tire microplastics, which are difficult to capture once emitted. In general, a mix of different policy instruments will be needed, so including regulatory, voluntary, but also information-based and potentially market-based instruments. In our work on microplastics, we also identified several categories of policy priorities, let's say. So on the first level, we identified the needs for governments to continue action to strengthen the knowledge base to inform policy intervention, essentially by promoting research, both on the risks associated with microplastics, but also on the availability and the cost effectiveness of the different mitigation measures. To this end, the harmonization of the test methods and the promotion of cross-industry collaboration and information sharing will be key to the advancement and acceleration of research. On a second level, despite the need for further research, we realized that there are several opportunities for no regrets policy interventions. So essentially measures which are driven by other policy goals, but which can also give co-benefits in terms of microplastics mitigation. One example, for instance, for tires, we know that reducing overall passenger vehicle use and incentivizing the production of lighter vehicles can lower greenhouse gases emissions and air pollution, but these can also lower microplastics emissions, essentially because the tire wear is dependent on the number of tires that you have in use, but also on the weight of vehicles. And then on a third level, there's also a need for governments to further assess and consider other policy tools which can be employed to target microplastics specifically, either to reduce emissions at source. Some examples can be minimum standards, labeling and information provision schemes, or best available techniques, or to improve the end-of-pipe capture of microplastics. For instance, via environmental quality standards, market-based tools, or potentially EPR. So now we will focus on EPR, but yeah, it's important to keep in mind that EPR is only one of the range of policy tools that you have available to target microplastics unintentionally released from products. Just to go back to the basics for a moment, even though I'm sure that everybody in the virtual room is familiar with the concept of EPR, at the OECD, we have a quite broad definition of EPR, which is that it is an environmental policy approach in which a producer responsibility for a product is extended to the post-consumer stage of a product's life cycle. We see that EPR schemes are widely employed. Most OECD countries have EPR schemes in place for certain product groups, and the uptake of EPR schemes has also been growing in several non-OECD countries. So what can be said about the achievements of EPR schemes in the past years? Well, there are several positive outcomes which can be mentioned. In the field of municipal solid waste, EPR schemes have contributed, together with other policies, to a decrease in landfilling and an increase in recycling. Secondly, EPR schemes that have also been effective at reducing the burden on municipalities, essentially by charging producers for some of the costs linked to the collection, sorting, and recycling of the waste streams that they target. And they have also generated significant economic opportunities, in particular for the recycling sector. Another initial intention of EPR was to also signal the cost, and in some sense internalize the costs of waste disposal to producers in order to provide incentives to them to better design their products in a way that minimized disposal costs at their end of life. But what we saw is that these intended effects materialized only up to a certain extent. So we observed some lightweighting and material substitution effects in packaging, but for essentially due to modulated EPR fees. But in other product groups, these effects on design for the environment have been minimal. So going back to microplastics, what lessons can be drawn from the experience of solid waste management? Well, again, let me say that we have not done work on this topic specifically, but essentially drawing from our updated guidance on EPR and from our work on microplastics, we would like to propose some relevant criteria and questions which can be useful to evaluate the relevance and potential of EPR to address microplastics pollution. The first question that needs to be asked is whether EPR schemes can be applied to microplastics. The answer is probably yes, although there is probably little scope to implement EPR schemes only for the purpose of microplastics, because it's unlikely that the implementation costs would be justified. However, there is an important caveat there, which is that where EPR systems are already in place, for instance, for product groups which are known to shed microplastics, such as tires, but also textiles, there could be an opportunity to extend these to also cover microplastics, essentially at a low cost. The second question relates to the financing aspect. So we have to understand whether EPR could generate the necessary funding for wastewater treatment or for other end-of-pipe options which can be considered. Again, probably the answer is probably yes. Given that this already occurs for solid waste, we would expect that EPR schemes would implement the polluter pays principle. However, the key issue here really relates to the challenge of apportioning the costs to different sources of microplastics and then to the different producers. Then another question that I'd like to propose is what would be the role of producers beyond the financing of end-of-pipe costs? So essentially, in existing systems, producers play a role in optimizing end-of-life value chains and minimizing costs. But in this case, there is to some extent a mismatch between the expertise of producers and the expertise which is required at the end-of-pipe level. So it is not necessarily evident which additional benefits an EPR scheme would bring in terms of value chain organization, and which additional benefits in this sense would justify the complex setup of an EPR scheme compared to other potentially simpler policy instruments. And then lastly, we have stressed many times that source reductions will be crucial for microplastics. So we have to ask, can EPR schemes induce effects on product design? Well, design for environment is one of the key objectives of EPR schemes in theory, but it has been proven to be difficult to materialize, at least in existing EPR schemes. So this is up for discussion. So to sum up, we see EPR as a relevant policy tool to internalize the costs of end-of-pipe treatment. But the question is really whether it would be the most cost-efficient tool to achieve these objectives, and whether the additional implementation burden that it entails compared to other tools is justified by additional benefits. But in any case, EPR, as it has been said, is only one of a number of policy instruments available, and other policy tools will, in any case, need to support it. That's all from my hand, and I will be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Butzik, for your intervention, for sharing specifically the key findings of your work, the lessons learned, but also the policy guidance when it comes to the unintentional release of microplastics, both from textiles and tires. I couldn't help but agree as well to all the points mentioned regarding the importance of information sharing, cross-sectoral collaboration, and more research as well, alongside the use of all available policy instruments. And on this note, I'm very happy to provide the floor to Mr. Oliver Löbel on behalf of Euro. Mr. Löbel is the Secretary General of Euro, which is the voice of Europe's drinking water and wastewater service providers from 29 countries, both from private and the public sectors. So Mr. Löbel would be very glad to receive your input as well to the discussion. Thank you very much. We cannot hear you at this stage. Perhaps you are still on mute, but I see your presentation is already available.
Okay, here I am, sorry. Can you see the presentation now?
No, not at this stage, but we can hear you very well and see you.
But can you activate share content? Yeah, okay, no. Okay. Is it showing now?
This is perfect, but it seems that there is an overlapping window on your screen.
Yeah, I wonder where this comes from.
Okay, this is perfect now.
Okay, because I can't see you.
Would it help if we try to share the presentation from our end?
Hang on, I just wonder what happened now. It's terrible. I can only see you. This is strange. Can't see the slides.
Mr. Löbel, this is Regine from the Secretariat of the
Yeah.
If you like, I can share your PowerPoint myself, and then you can see us and you can see also your PowerPoint.
Okay, but I still can't show active speaker. So why can't I? Okay, let's do it this way. Sorry, I can't see the slides now, but I will just start, huh?
Okay, thank you very much. And then we can on our end ensure that it's visible also for our audience.
Yeah, sorry for that. Yes, so now I can see it also again. Yes, so thank you very much, Chair, for giving me the floor and for the brief introduction. So we go to the next slide. So as you have said, Euro is the European Federation of Water Services with almost 70,000 operators in membership through 34 national trade associations. So next slide, please. And I would like to share with you today a study that we have published last year on extended producer responsibility on both micropollutants and microplastics released from products. Next slide, please. the EPR has already been defined by Elena, so I will not repeat this. I think what is very important in this context is that both the Water Framework the Waste Framework Directive and the Single-Use Plastics Directive define extended producer responsibility very clearly by putting the responsibility on the producers, as the name says. In the previous meeting, also the tire manufacturers were not very clear. They said, well, it's too complicated because we have the retailers, we have the users. The responsibility is very clearly on the producers of products that release certain substances or particles. Next slide, please. Why is EPR needed as a concept? First of all, we have, of course, the treaty, Article 919.2, which clearly says that environmental policy must be based on preventive measures and source control, and if this is not enough, then the polluter should pay for corrective measures. And EPR is one possible tool of applying the polluter pays principle. Secondly, in the Water Framework Directive, we have a clear reference to cost recovery in accordance with the polluter pays principle. So also there is a hook somehow to implement EPR requirements. Thirdly, the United Nations support the right to water, and this is based on a number of aspects like availability, accessibility, affordability, etc. For us as water service providers, in particular, of course, accessibility and affordability are threatened when we find more and more unwanted substances and particles in wastewater that require additional treatment. So this also jeopardizes our capacity to provide the right to water to Europe's population. And fourthly, the investment needs we already face today, and this is of course not directly linked to microplastics. So the OECD estimated the investment needs in the wastewater sector at more than 250 billion euros, and there we do not take account of additional measures to address micropollutants, microplastics, or change sludge management options. Next slide. So what we did in the study, we tried to look at EU legislation and check how this legislation needs to be changed to apply EPR schemes to microplastics and micropollutants. We looked at both horizontal and product-specific legislation. Horizontal could be REACH, could be Waste Directive. Sector-specific, for example, could be directly related to pharmaceuticals, to tires, or to textiles. And then we compared also control at source measures and end-of-pipe measures. I will come back to that at a second. When it comes to the sectors covered and microplastics, we looked at both synthetic textiles and tires. Next slide, please. Here is the overview of the legislation we looked into. Do not try to read that, that's too much. So we see several horizontal pieces of legislation: Water Framework Directive, REACH, Industrial Emissions Directive, Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, and sector-specific legislation for tires and textiles, for example, here in red circles. When it comes to tires, the tire labeling regulation was considered as an appropriate tool to look into when thinking about EPR schemes, and textiles, the Waste Framework Directive was identified as the most appropriate tool. Next slide, please. Then we looked also into the relevance of voluntary measures, control at source and EPR, versus mandatory measures. Again, control at source and EPR. And I think the result was very clear in terms of policy efficiency, obtaining results, and also acceptability, combining mandatory controlled source measures with mandatory post-marketing EPR measures was considered most appropriate. And controlled source, just to give you an example, as you see here, could be market authorization, could be restrictions, using best available techniques, etc. If you look further down the supply chain, then these would be considered post-marketing measures. So next slide. Then we compared the effectiveness or the appropriateness of the different pieces of legislation that we have selected to introduce EPR schemes. And here we came, of course, to some differences because products are regulated in different ways at EU level. So for tires, in principle, we can say it's relatively easy to assign responsibilities because we have already basically a register of producers or importers, and also financing is already available, so we could build on that. When it comes to textiles, the situation is more difficult. So we do not have today, for example, a register of all importers or manufacturers readily available. And also for financing, we would have to build mostly from the scratch, apart from, for example, an EPR scheme that we have for end-of-life textiles in France. Policy coherence with other pieces of legislation would need to be addressed in both cases. Next slide, please. Looking at textiles again, so what we said, Waste Framework Directive could be an appropriate tool to implement EPR because it has already a chapter on textiles with requirements to be implemented over the next years. So this could be a starting point, but not an easy one. So with all the weak points that I have just mentioned also. And in addition, you would also need to introduce accompanying controlled source measures, like textile labeling, so empowering the consumer to know the level of synthetic fibers released by the product he or she purchases. Industrial Emissions Directive could be strengthened, also mainly addressing the production phase, and eco-design, for example, by requiring pre-washing of synthetic textiles, because we know that during the first wash, a large part of the life cycle emissions of microfibers occur. So next slide, please. What the study recommended at the end of the day is very much in line with what Michelle and Elena have already stressed. So EPR is one solution. It's one policy tool, but it's certainly not the one that will resolve the problem of microplastics. I can focus here on 3 of these 6 points. So very clearly, full life cycle approach is needed, and the earlier in the life cycle you take action, the more effective it will be. So EPR can only be complementary to strong and effective controlled source and precautionary measures. Would also like to highlight the 5th recommendation here, stakeholder dialogue, very important. We cannot solve the problems by working against one another. We have to talk to each other, learn from each other, and also try to find the best solutions together. And the 6th point, very important, we need an in-depth cost-benefit analysis of all the measures that can be taken along the life cycle, product design, product consumption phase, end-of-life phase, and also establish the environmental impact of taking measures at all these levels. Next slide, please. One way to address perhaps textiles better in the future can be found in the future EU strategy for textiles. So we have identified a number of weak points to apply EPR to textiles in the current legislative setup. But the roadmap on the EU strategy for textiles clearly wants to consider the role of EPR in promoting sustainable textiles and treatment of textile waste. So this could be also then a way to apply EPR to microfibers that are synthetic microfibers that are released during the life cycle of these textiles. And the Commission is also working on a detailed cost-benefit analysis, so an impact assessment type study on possible policy measures reducing unintentional release of microplastics from tires, from pellets and textiles. And here I think it is very important that we think of the Green Deal compliance of all the solutions that we will propose in terms of climate, greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, resource use, and circular economy. Okay, I think I come to my concluding remarks. Yeah, very clearly, as already pointed out by the previous speakers, control at source measures, precautionary measures must have priority. That's the only and best way to tackle the problem effectively. There may be a need for additional measures down the value chain. And if those measures need to be taken, then EPR must cut in, or a similar tool that implements the polluter pays principle. We agree with Michel, with the European Commission also, that the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive might not be the right tool to address microplastics due to the huge number of pathways, the already high retention rates in wastewater treatment plants, and also the impact on the circular economy, because removing microplastics doesn't make them disappear. So they end up in, for example, partially end up in sewage sludge with all the problems we have heard of. Measures must be Green Deal proof, as I have just pointed out, and very important statement at the end. So the EU must not replace the polluter pays principle by the water consumer pays principle. So this would be the worst case scenario for us. So last slide, please. With this, I come to the end of my presentation. I'm sorry for the technical problems at the very beginning, and yeah, I'm ready to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lebel, for your intervention, setting the scene to begin with on why EPR is needed in the context of the polluter pays principle. Of course, it's also equally important to use of all the policy instruments available, as mentioned. So once again, thank you for sharing the relevant policy options and the specific measures linked with the conducted study. On this note, I think that a lot of light was shed on textiles. And while I'm aware that our audience is also looking forward to the EU strategy for textiles, I'm very happy to let you know that we are joined by Mr. Scalia on behalf of Euratex. Mr. Scalia is Director on Sustainable Business in Euratex, the European Confederation of Textile and Apparel Industry in Brussels. And specifically, Mr. Scalia is responsible for sustainability in chemicals, circular economy, climate change, and due diligence. Mr. Scalia, we're very pleased to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you confirm you hear me and see me fine?
Yes, very well.
Thank you. I just have some difficulties in visualizing the share presenter slide. Perhaps in the interest of time, Regine might display the slide so we avoid any technical.
I can share it for you.
Appreciate that. Thank you. And sorry also for this strange visualization. Sunbeam just entered through the window all of a sudden. I hope it's still fine. While Regine is loading up the slide, which I now see coming up, thanks. I thank you again to inviting us, the European textile and apparel industry, which we represent at this event. We heard many different opinions. We appreciate that. It's an important moment to discuss this point. So without any further ado, I would like to go straight into the point and ask kindly, thank you. So to begin with, I just give you a few figures about what is the industry of textile in Europe. We talk about textile. Textile is a different type of textile product. You have garments, which is most commonly referred as a textile product. You have home textiles, you have a lot of technical textile produced not for being worn by consumers, but goes in any other value chain. It's a very sizable industry, talk about more than 160,000 companies in the European Union of 27 member states. And you see also the figures for employment, which is quite substantial as well, 1.6 million. When it comes to garment, I think that's a point relevant for EPR. You can imagine that about 5 billion of textile products, of garments, circulating in the EU are made in the EU itself, whereas about 23 billion of items are imported from outside the European Union territory. I think that's a relevant element. If we go to the next slide, in the next 10 minutes or so, I would share industry perspective on two topics, the EPR as such, which of course is one of the key elements of today, and on microplastic. In the first case, I'd like to show our opinion, our point of view, which has been developed recently on the broader transition to circular economy. So not necessarily on microplastic only. It's about how EPR play a role in the transition to circular economy. That's what our view is about. Microplastic, I'm very pleased to have this opportunity because it's a topic we've been working for 3 years already, not as an industry alone, but mostly with researchers. So if you go to the next point, next slide, please. This is a screenshot, a symbol, a reference to our position paper, which is publicly available. And I think it's important to stress here that the industry, our industry, is quite open to discuss the use of EPR items and tools. And I really would like to mention this up front. There is no like a prejudice or a preconception on EPR, but we have identified after long discussion in our membership 7 elements which could, in our opinion, make a good EPR as such. To begin with, it should be designed to support circularity. It should consider that textiles are extremely different products. I know that our industry said the same thing last time, because I think probably it's a fact that value chain are inherently complex and different type of products. When we say it should solve real problems, we refer to the fact that it could be used, as we see in experience, to solve short-term problem or to cover costs. This is a practice largely used in many areas. In our opinion, it should support a transition to circular economy, which is a bigger goal. And this is something that we need to think about in terms of how do we prioritize what we want to do. And then a number of points that I'm not going to read them in the interest of time, but it refers to the fact that EPR present benefits, but also present limits and potential unintended consequences. And I think everybody, whether it's industry, policymakers, NGO, we all want to reflect on what could be the best mean towards a goal. What are the unintentional consequences, which we actually see happening a lot in many pieces of legislation, whether it's rich chemical management or many other points. The other elements is that EPR are run, based on the experience of textile at least, by member states. And as we see now, EPR being introduced, being discussed in Sweden and the Netherlands, in France already exists for many, many years and have taught us many lessons. We need to be mindful of what is the different approach pursued by a member state to find the best solutions. So these are just some thoughts about EPR. They could be a good tool. They have certainly some advantages as long as they are made in the right way when it comes to the transition to the circular economy. If we go exactly to the next slide, then I enter a bit on the point on microplastic. And here I'm very pleased to share some updates on the cross-industry agreement to prevent microplastic releases. This is an initiative which we announced in, well, a long time ago now. I think it was January 2018. 5 industry associations, Eurotex, the detergent, ISE, the sports goods, FASI, Memen Fiber Surfs, and EOG Outdoor Group. They come together to define, to work on research and solution for microplastic. What we have done essentially has been a work to support researchers from across the globe to come together and discuss a harmonized test methods to quantify the release of microplastic when washing synthetic textiles. I think it was important to see it in the previous slides, both in the Commission, the OECD, how important is to have a harmonized test methods. And I would like just to give some insights on these methods. If we go to the next slide, it's a method that we have as the key aim to basically compare fabrics. It has to be simple, something which can be used pretty much in every labs. It doesn't require hyper complicated technologies or complex system to use it. It is designed following 16 parameters, which have been defined by researchers, not by the industry. The industry acts as a facilitator, and eventually give us the benefit of being able to assess the differences between fabrics when it comes to shedding of microplastic. It is not meant to quantify the total release of microplastic in the environment. That is not what the method will do. If we go to the next slide, this is to remind us how many myth versus fact we have come across in this work. All of this information is, by the way, public, is available in the website of the 5 associations. We have seen so many myths, so many cliches, and then we learn through the researchers' presentation about the real facts of this issue. We also learn mostly that there are many knowledge gaps that still have to be fulfilled. One among the others, it is not true that microplastic are released mostly from textile, but this was also so before. Or they don't only come from washing of synthetic textile. It can come from different phases, through the design, the production, the different steps of production, the use phase, and the afterlife. And it's important to assess that, because we heard a lot about stopping the emission at source. Then we need to understand what is meant to be the source, because that can help us in identify possible solutions. If we go to the next slide, I would like to stress the fact that, as somebody mentioned before, the industry is not a research or scientist-based organization. So in this exercise, we collaborated with scientists and researchers from across the globe, from the United States to Japan to Hong Kong to many qualified labs in Europe. All of them focus on this specific issue, textile release from washing, microplastic release from washing of synthetic textiles. We have come together, the method has been successfully developed. It is now being handed over to CEN, the European Committee for Standardization, and we really hope that this could facilitate and accelerate the development of harmonized test methods, which was indeed the goal set at the beginning, upon the reflection that only by having a harmonized test method, then you can compare solutions in a harmonized way. You can compare apple with apples and pears with pears, so to say. As a next step, just a quick word on that, we plan to launch a research project to investigate the impact of possible measures at different stages of the production phases. This element here recalls us about uncertainties that we have in this domain. We acknowledge that there is an understandable concern on the impact of microplastic on the environment, on marine life and health. But one thing pretty much every scientific-based statement reflects upon is that we need data. We have limited information. We have no evidence to judge exactly not only how to stop the mitigation, but also what actually is the real risk about microplastics. That, of course, does not stop us to take action now. As I mentioned before, our industry already moved 3 years ago, so before this became a political priority. But we believe that it's only upon only working on decision based upon scientific evidence and result that the best solution can be found. And with that, I would move towards my conclusion in the 10 or so minutes available at my disposal. So to conclude, we believe data generated in large amounts and comparable is what we need to have to begin investigating possible solution to this issue. Knowing the risk, it's also going to be very important, because at any point, whenever any policy measure will be assessed, whether it is through the Industrial Emission Directive, as mentioned before, or EPR or eco-design, we also need to be aware of the proportionality of any measures which have to be introduced. Based on that, I think proposals can be made on what are the effective solutions. Again, based on the outcome of research. So our suggestion is to move on a step-by-step approach. A lot has been done quickly to develop a harmonized test method. We think this is a very encouraging result. There is a community of scientists and researchers working on these items. There is a commitment from the industry side. And obviously, there is very much an interest and priority elements from the European Union institutions. So in that sense, our invite is only to work together on this matter and to make feasible and successful proposal based on that. And I would just stop here. And I'm very happy to take questions and participate in discussion in this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scalia, to begin with, for joining us today, but also for sharing your contribution and then the EU textile and clothing industry vision with regards to EPR. At the same time, of course, there is a concern on the impacts on, when it comes to the discussion of today's event, on the impact on environment, marine life and health, but definitely more research on the topic is needed. Just to let me take this opportunity to also reply to some questions from the audience. So yes, indeed, we plan on sharing the presentation of speakers following their green light. And on behalf of the Secretariat, indeed, the recording will be made available following this event. On this note, please allow me also to invite our audience to send us your questions, as we are soon approaching the Q&A session with our speakers. With regards to the latter also, I'm very happy to be welcomed by MEP Mr. Kibouropoulos, member of the European Parliament for the EPP, but also coming from Greece. Mr. Kibouropoulos is inter alia a member of the Committee on Employment and Social Affairs, but also a substitute member of the Committee of Regional Development. And coming from the Mediterranean region and specifically from Greece, I'm aware that topics on plastics, microplastics and pollution are very close to Mr. Kibouropoulos' heart and of course remain key among his policy priorities. So Mr. Kibouropoulos, we're very happy to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gambas, for your warm words. For them panelists, dear Frank, personally, I would like to congratulate you for this initiative. I'm close to you to support this SIM, the EPR SIM. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for organizing this event, and I'm very glad participating in this way of new thinking, I would say. And also, I would like to congratulate you for your effort focusing on the strategies regarding EPR SIMs and the technical implementation. As you know, as the previous panelists have referred, that over the past 50 years, the role and importance of plastics in our economy has consistently grown. Global production of plastics has increased by reaching 322 million tons in 2015. It is expected to double again over the next 20 years. The numbers related to plastics are huge. In the EU, the plastic sector employs 1.5 million people and generated a turnover of 340 billion in 2015. Around 25.8 million tons of plastic waste are generated in Europe every year. Less than 30% of such waste is collected for recycling. The potential for recycled plastic waste remains largely unexploited in the EU, and very large quantities of plastic waste leak into the environment from sources both on land and sea, generating significant economic and environmental damage, as we have heard. What we do and what we can do support circularity across the whole life cycle of the product, from selection to materials and design to its end of life, and especially for the take back, recycling and disposal. Firstly, we can adopt the successful Dutch and Flemish examples that show a Green Deal on circular procurement can fast track the development of circular economy. Circular procurement can accelerate the transition by creating demand for circular products and services, thereby helping to create economies of scale. It builds on clean public procurement, which can lack concrete results even when mandatory. The European Commission could fund a massive free training program on circular procurement in all member states. Another initiative is to create circular hubs based on public-private partnerships aiming to accelerating the transition to a circular economy by providing support to SMEs and companies for the implementation of circular models at the local, regional, and national level. This is why they should be set up in each member states depending on the regional priorities and needs. How extend responsibility can foster the circular strategy in the EU? EPR is a strategy to and all of the environmental costs associated with a particular product life cycle to the market price of that product. EPR is a financial and operational instrument which has double carrying, internalizing environmental externalities related to end-of-life management and fostering the operational implementation of sustainable product and waste management schemes in line with the waste hierarchy and with quantitative recycling and recovery targets. Therefore, focuses on shifting responsibility upstream to the producer away from municipalities, as well as on giving incentives to producers to incorporate environmental considerations in the design of their products. The coverage and quality of EPR schemes is important because they give economic incentives needed for two reasons: to accelerate the new circular regime and to destabilize the old, linear one. From the perspective of sustainable companies, such as those in the membership of Ecopreneur, the lack of demand for circular products and services at current price is the #1 hurdle for implementing circular business models. Does existing EPR schemes need improvement of all adjustments? I will answer yes. And in order to achieve the green transitions, we have first to seek greater harmonization of EPR schemes through European Union, wide definitions and criteria for EPR minimum requirements for product design relating to the material design and origin, as well as limits on additives, chemical substances that are problematic for product waste management and recycling. Second, to enhance the performance of existing EPR schemes by ensuring clear allocation of responsibilities among involved stakeholders, effective monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, including the imposition of sanctions as well as full cost coverage of EPR schemes so that producers have the maximum possible incentive. Third, to support better the integration of EPR schemes into European Union environmental and circular economy objectives. Fourth, to boost the effectiveness of EPR schemes in meeting reuse and recycle targets by coupling it with economic instruments such as landfill and incineration taxes disposal. And finally, to extend EPR schemes to additional types or application of plastics. To conclude, we really need to support the EPR policy approach with specific initiatives and reciprocations for big enterprises, but also for SMEs. We should give double benefits in B2B initiatives with sectors of major users like agri-food and tourism industry, with million SMEs operating in European Union. The issue of plastic is a huge issue, and therefore I'm going to invite you in tomorrow a joint discussion in the MV committee with Petty committee that we discuss how can we manage the plastic, the future of plastic. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for the invitation once more.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kibouropoulos, for your key feedback, but also for the specific policy recommendations, for your support on the EPR policy approach, but also for highlighting that the need for economic initiatives and support for enterprises, but also for SMEs equally important. On this note, I'm very happy to, looking at the event's agenda, to proceed with the Q&A session with our audience. With regards to that, I see that there is a question in Slovenian, which unfortunately I couldn't take, but I see that Mr. Bogovič has replied bilaterally, so I'm happy for that. Moving on, I would like to invite our speakers to open their cameras, since the point would be to have an open exchange and a panel discussion to follow. To begin with, the first question, well, having identified the key role of EPR as a policy instrument to tackle microplastic pollution, and following the presentation of the European Commission of Mr. Sponar, I would like to open the floor to Elena, Oliver, and Mauro to hear their points of views on the specific challenges ahead. We heard from the European Commission about feasibility, acceptability, quantification of what is placed on the market, quantification of the release and pathways to environment as well, identification of associated costs, but also allocation of costs. So on this note, I'd like to invite our panelists for a first, perhaps maximum 1 minute reaction each to the statements and the input of the European Commission. Perhaps we can start with Elena from OECD.
Sure. Thanks a lot for the question. Well, first of all, let me just say we definitely agree with the need to take a holistic approach, which involves all stakeholders and which looks at all the life cycle stages of products, as well as the need to take into account and implement a mix of quality tools, including regulatory and economic instruments. But more specifically on EPR and the challenges that we see ahead, there are two main things that I think are worth mentioning from our end, which is one challenge, as you also mentioned, will have to do with the apportioning of costs and the assignment of responsibilities. As we saw, microplastics come from a huge variety of sources, and those sources also come from very different types of producers. On the second aspect, the other challenge will be to assess to what extent EPR can deliver in terms of design for environment. We saw that source reduction would be crucial for microplastics mitigation, but as we have seen, EPR has not necessarily delivered in terms of design for the environment. So it will need to be carefully assessed under what conditions EPR delivers on eco-design against criteria which can be, durability, recyclability, reusability, and so on, but also possibly against a new criteria which can be possibly aligned with microplastics reduction at source. Let me just say, perhaps my colleague Martin Dubois would want to jump in here, because he's also working on specifically on fee modulation for EPR.
Yeah, thank you, Elena, to pass on the word. Your question was about the barriers for putting EPR to use. I would just like to come back to some of the barriers mentioned earlier. And one is the lack of reliable and quantified information. We're speaking about microplastics. Actually, at OECD, we're doing a flagship exercise at the moment, which is called the Global Plastics Outlook to 2060. So we're trying to quantify and to assess what's going to happen with plastics by 2060. Well, clearly, the going to 2060 is difficult, but just finding the proper data already now on what is happening now is quite an issue. So I think that's the first topic I would like to highlight, is the lack of reliable data. The second thing is about feasibility. I think on itself, the OECD has a very clear definition of EPR, and it's about internalizing external costs. It's very clear that microplastics are an externality. If you wouldn't have textiles or tires, you wouldn't have microplastics leaking to the environment. And so the externality, and I'd say the principle to apply EPR is very clear. The constraint is really in feasibility. EPR up till now has been implemented on waste, well, littering these days, it's also implemented. But whether it can be used to finance, for example, wastewater treatment plants, that's clearly a step further. That's entering into a different domain. So the question is the feasibility, is the link and the solution, is it close enough to the issue or not? And I think the third barrier is really about, well, it's not so much about acceptability, because that was a topic that I heard several times. The reality is that producers are typically not necessarily enthusiastic when they are faced with EPR. So acceptability on itself is not a good criteria. It's more making sure, and I think here the Textile Federation put forward a very clear view. And so it's more about making sure that when EPR is implemented, that it's functional, that it works, that there's efficiency, there's effectiveness, but acceptability on itself is not a strong topic. If it's the right policy to make, then, well, producers will just have to accept whether they want it or not. So I think these were the three main barriers and the main concerns, I think, to take into account when deciding whether or not to apply EPR for microplastics.
Thank you very much. Mr. Leubel, perhaps?
Yes, thank you. I can support many of the things that just have been said. What we need, and this is already underway, as I've pointed out before, is determining all the possible mitigation options that we have. We have seen, of course, everybody highlighted it, controlled source measures must be the starting point, but there are also measures down the supply chain for mitigating the release of microplastics, tire wear particles or microfibers, and we have to check those in terms of effectiveness, in terms of cost, and in terms of, as I've mentioned it, Green Deal compliance. So to what extent do they contribute to reaching all the strategies, the strategic goals that we have set under the Green Deal? And I agree that we still face a number of complexities. We have seen under the Single-Use Plastics Directive that the European legislator is willing to introduce EPR schemes for diffuse litter in that case. So, for example, cigarette filters, you cannot retrace the producer directly, but still the tobacco industry is jointly responsible for collecting or paying for the collection of this litter. So there are already precedents in place where this is being done. I agree, test methods need to be developed. The quantification of total release is a difficult one, because once, for example, we get a requirement to treat, to add additional treatment, the question is not whether it's 100,000 tons or 80,000 tons, it's a requirement to treat. So for me, knowing the very exact figures is not the key challenge. It will be important, as also Elena has pointed out, to reduce the cost of such schemes. And here, combining different methods, like through the textile strategy, end-of-life collection of textiles, combining this with requirements for microfibers, addressing the same group of companies, might help to reduce the overall cost. So you can develop synergies here. Generally, very open. We need to address the problem. EPR is one tool that we should pursue, but if there are more efficient tools to introduce polluter pays principle, this is something that needs to be discussed, of course.
Thank you very much, Mr. Global. And Mr. Scalia, I see that you wanted to take the floor as well.
Yes, thank you. Briefly, as you asked, yes, I think on your question directly, the Commission made very punctual assessment of some pros and cons of the system. I find ourselves quite aligned with that. How to allocate the funds, how to set up a structure which will be running the whole system, and how to use the funds, one collected, to reduce emission at source, because that is being said by many speakers as one of the priorities. In addition to the pros and cons that the Commission has said, perhaps one specific aspect of the feasibility deals with enforceability. And here I would like to be very clear, because our industry association, our sector, points out on many occasions that we need to be mindful of what are the actual impact on the ground of the legislation design in Brussels. Bearing in mind that the enforcement is a responsibility of the member states. And we have seen for so many years sort of exchanging views on where the roles lay, actually. Now, I was mentioning before, there are 28 billion of garments circulating in the EU on annual basis. Currently, the system to monitor and control all these garments is not effective. We don't know how to control the e-commerce purchases, for instance. We need to keep the trade going in a smoothless way, but at the same time, we have more and more legislation coming up. And the question is, are we hitting the right targets? Are we stopping free riders? Are we able to catch the worst 10% of products in the market? So these are, I think, are points very much important in this discussion. And last point is about priority. Let's not forget that textile is now being addressed by many, many policy priorities. EU textile strategy was mentioned. We look forward to that, to be very honest, because it can also put some order into this legislative action now. We look at eco-design, mandatory criteria for green public procurement, digital product passports, and we can mention many others. EPR for textile already being evaluated by several member states, as I mentioned. So if you like, some cars of the trains already left. And where do we want to put our priorities? Do we need to support reduced consumption, better consumption, the right system for recycling? We have an initiative called Recycling Hubs, which aims at creating a market for secondary raw materials based on textile waste. So we need to look at not reinventing the wheel, in our opinion. As we say, for microplastic, we believe data and research are the way forward, and happy to keep the discussion also within the framework of the textile strategy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scalia. Thank you very much for to all the speakers. On this note, I would also like to address a question to Mr. Sponer. Specifically, well, all speakers mentioned, referring to the discussion and to the theme of today's event, all speakers referred to intentionally, but also mostly unintentionally added microplastics. So, Mr. Sponer, linked with the fifth among the EPR challenges mentioned, which is the allocation of costs, I would like to kindly ask you, how do you see the role of EPR and how to best share the responsibilities? And specifically, what's your opinion on who should be charged?
Oh, good question. I mean, you know, I think that we don't have to mix the role of the different instruments. I think that, for instance, if it's possible to avoid placing some products which intentionally add microplastics on the market, we should do it, and we are going to do it through the REACH regulation. When there is a clear alternative, you know, and when we can simply avoid placing this product on the market, we should do it. Then EPR should come only when in the range of what is authorized to be placed on the market, you know. And so I think the first thing to do is to work on the product policy to try to really limit either those products creating a lot of microplastics, or when they are placed on the market, to really keep those products which are the less detrimental and the less emitting microplastics. Then you have the remaining part of these microplastics going into the environment through different you know, pathway, and that's where it becomes complicated, because I think that the EPR schemes can certainly help to finance additional infrastructure to remove microplastics at different level of the chain, including in the wastewater. But I would say if they are in the wastewater, it's already too late, you know, but we know that it will happen and it will continue to happen. Huh? But to finance what? And that's a good question. To finance additional, so far there is no technology to remove microplastics from the wastewater treatment before they are going into the sludge. So that's the problem. If we would have a clear technology, you know, and a clear cost additional treatment in the wastewater treatment sector to capture these microplastics before they are going into the sludge, so maybe it could make sense when these sludge are used in agriculture particularly. So I'm sorry to be extremely pragmatic and concrete, but I think that's probably one of the success conditions of this EPR scheme is to be concrete, pragmatic, and, you know, to have concrete tonnage and a concrete allocation of the different tonnage coming from different industries. So we are not yet there, I would say, you know, on our side, but we are continuing to work, and probably our impact assessment will be a first step, because we will be able to quantify the different pathway. We will contribute to identify the different pathway. And probably I've seen, you know, some estimates which are clearly showing that at the end, you know, and it was mentioned, I think, last time, that stormwater overflows or urban runoff are the first pathway for these microplastics. So should we consider in the future additional investment in stormwater overflows and urban runoff management? That will create additional cost, and should we send this cost back to the industry? That's a question mark. I think that we need to really properly assess the consequences. I also agree, based on the long experience in solid waste, that sometimes in some countries you have EPR schemes which are in place, and it's questionable because the administrative burden, administrative costs are relatively high compared to the flux which are generated. So indeed, we need to have a cost efficiency analysis. That's why we are making impact assessment, by the way, and that's why we are consulting also the stakeholder. So probably in some cases, it might be a very good complement tool. It has been proven. In other cases, it's not. So we are open to the discussion at Commission level. We think that it's a good instrument. Probably one of the main merit of these instruments, and I would like to insist a little bit on that, the good example are showing that suddenly we are forcing industry, placing some products on the market and creating different environmental problems to discuss with other authorities which are in charge of you know, the collection of waste, of solid waste, or in this case in charge of wastewater treatment collection and collection and treatment. And I think from this dialogue between industry, you know, at the origin of some products and the end treater, I would say, is really profitable, because that's where we can find optimal solution on the field and optimizing the whole chain. So I would just plea for making progress and to continue this dialogue and to push really industry to continue the dialogue with those at the end of the chain, you know, to try to find optimal solution, even if they will not appear in the short term in a legal text, but it will come in one day or another. This microplastic problems is important, and we cannot simply close our eyes and wait. You know, I am sensitive on the fact that we need standard method, etc., that we need research, and that we need better quantification. But it must not at all be a pretext to not act and to not act today, because otherwise it will, you know, solution might be a little bit more brutal later on. So I would encourage everybody to continue this dialogue, which is fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sponar, for this point. And also, I think that on behalf of the European Parliament Intergroup, this is exactly what we really commit to the multi-stakeholder dialogue with relevant stakeholders and players from different sides. I would also like to perhaps make a transition there and ask for Oliver's feedback on what we heard from Mr. Sponar. And please allow me to also connect this question with another one received by the audience, which is very much linked to your statements, Oliver. It reads, if EPR is not the dream instrument to tackle microplastics pollution, then what should be the instrument to be adopted in order to avoid a water consumer pays principle instead of the polluter pays principle?
Yeah, first of all, small comment on what Michel Sponar said. So I can, wholeheartedly support his statements, and I also support his previous statements that also we, as the wastewater industry, of course, we have our role to play, and CSO, so combined sewer overflows and urban runoff, are two sources of or two pathways of microplastics to the environment that need to be tackled also with a view to climate change and the expected increase in heavy downpours that we will probably see over the years to come. Of course, these are solutions that we cannot implement ourselves. So we will have to work with local authorities, urban planners, because what we see in an increasing number of countries is that just putting more concrete, more pipes in the ground is also from a climate change point of view, so in embodied climate change impacts, not necessarily the best solution. We need to work towards nature-based solutions wherever possible and technically feasible. So this is certainly something that we are very willing to accompany. And I also agree that measures need to be taken now. We should not wait until we have all the figures 100% correct. We will never have them 100% correct. But the urgency also in public opinion is just increasing. So this is important. And the other question was regarding, where is it in the chat?
Let me read it out loud for you once again. So the question reads, if EPR is not a dream instrument,
yes,
instrument to be adopted in order to avoid the water consumer pays principle instead of the polluter pays principle?
Yeah, first of all, again, as I stressed several times, for us, controlled source and precautionary measures come at the very beginning. So there is a lot of knowledge already on making better garments which shed less synthetic fibers. There is a lot of research going on better production technologies that shed less synthetic fibers. As I said, first wash under controlled conditions of garments with containing synthetic fibers will make a lot of differences looking at life cycle releases of fibers. The same on tires, as the OECD, as Elena has pointed out, switching to more sustainable modes of transport, which release less tire wear particles, like public transport, bikes, etc., are very good ways. Controlled source measures, which are tick all the boxes of the Green Deal in terms of climate change, in terms of resource use, in terms of public health, etc. When it comes to EPR as an instrument to finance downstream measures, we think it's a valuable tool to explore further. But of course, we have to be open also. You may say, well, a levy or a tax may be more effective. If this is judged as a more appropriate tool by legislators to make sure that these external costs are internalized into the product price, then why not? So we are very open on that. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Global. Then turning to the European Commission and looking ahead with regards to concrete measures and solutions, we also heard from MEP Mr. Bogovič, who summarized perfectly all the available EU tools and the existing legislation. We also heard from different speakers about concrete policy recommendations. So, Mr. Sponer, when discussing about instruments in place, would a plastic tax, restrictions or recycling quotas, as mentioned before, be considered?
Well, when it comes to a tax, you know that it requires unanimity at European level. So we can dream of it, but to be honest, from the political point of view, it's probably the most complex instruments to be raised at European level. So I think that EPR is more easy to, I mean, there is an acceptance in the European community that EPR is an appropriate tool for different flows. Probably we are less prudent than our colleagues of OECD. We are in the action there, and you know, I understand their point of view. They are making a very good economic analysis, and we were, by the way, working with them to develop guidance on how best to design EPR schemes. But probably we have to decide. We are a political organization and we have to solve problems, you know. I was, like it was mentioned by Oliver, agreeably surprised by the single-use plastic directive, because there you have indeed the principle of producer responsibility for different waste streams, which are not directly collected by the waste operator, but simply collected by, because they are litter, so they are illegal waste in a sense, you know. But so this EPR was extended to that, and also to other things like fishing gears. So I think that you have a possibility in the European Commission to discuss this type of instruments, which is more easy than a tax because of this, you know, constraints of unanimity. I think on product policy, we are going to make also steps. You know, the fact that REACH is taken on board, microplastic is something which is new and which is interesting. and which will deliver concretely in the coming days, I hope. So for the rest, I think that the other actions are related to the textile strategy, but also to the impact assessment done on the microplastics as such, which will, as I was mentioning, envisage different type of solution or combination of solution. So that's a little bit the perspective. In the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, we will analyze, we have a specific study on EPR and the role of EPR for liquid waste, you know. But probably microplastic will not be our first priority because, as I was mentioning, there is so far no clear technology and no clear cost associated to microplastics in the system. But that could change. It's I'm speaking about the knowledge of today. If, you know, to be honest and to be pragmatic again, EPR might be probably more easy applicable to other type of pollution in urban wastewater treatment than for plastics, but it could come later. So that's a little bit our thinking now, but we will discuss all that in the impact assessment in a very transparent way. I mean, building on different studies, including the one of Euro, we are now really in a phase of gathering information for possibilities of EPR for liquid waste, and all that will be presented in the context of our impact assessment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spooner. I hope this also replies to the questions received by the audience. Another question, let me read that out loud for you, is more of a comment. Last question is, I think we should consider microplastics as littering in EPR systems. What is the European Commission opinion on that?
Well, I just explained that, yes, we have that in mind, but we will check the feasibility of the system, you know, and we will see, I mean, OECD mentioned different criteria for having a well-designed system, and we are very sensitive to that. By the way, if you read the Waste Framework Directive, there are different conditions for which are imposed on the existing EPR scheme in solid waste, and it's a clear source of inspiration for all EPR schemes that we are considering at European level, and it is related to the full cost, you know, transfer. It's related to allocation of the cost. It's related also to modulation of the cost according to the type of product which is placed on the market. But it's also connected to transparency. I think experience from EPR schemes are showing that it must be transparent. It must be cooperative, transparent. Otherwise, there is a risk there is different risks of not optimal system. Again, I think that transparency and dialogue between the different steps in the chain are a key condition for the success of such a system. And to me, it's really an added value. I'm sincere in thinking that probably in some member states reaching high level of recycling today, it was only possible thanks to this EPR scheme. Without the EPR scheme, it would have taken much more time. You know, if we would have waited to have taxes or to have other economic instruments, I think we would not have this success today in some advanced countries. Huh? But the condition is to have a transparent and well-designed EPR scheme. I think we have learned from this lesson, and if we go now to wastewater or other type of domain for EPR, we can certainly learn from the experience from the waste sector.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spooner. Perhaps we can take just one final question from the audience, which is very much linked to what we heard in your previous intervention, Mr. Spooner, but also very much linked to the work of OECD. And that reads, do you see any challenges with regards to the responses, differences and similarities in EU, but also at the international sphere? This is targeting the intervention of Ms. Butzi.
Yes, first let me just react to a few things which have been said until now. I agree with many of the things which have been said, and it would be impossible to react to all of them. But just on EPR, let me say that we absolutely agree on the need to be pragmatic on it. We see the benefits of putting in place instruments which internalize the externalities associated with product design and to better implement the polluter pays principle. Our point is really to stress the importance of the need to demonstrate the value added of EPR compared to potentially other simpler measures, and it's due to its higher administrative burden, and in general to assess its efficiency compared to other measures. Then on the point that you mentioned on, sorry, it was on alternative policy measures and synergies, was it?
It was on challenges in responses, and so specifically at differences and similarities in EU, but also the international sphere.
Yes, okay. Well, as I said earlier during my presentation, you know, for many of the policy instruments that could already be implemented for microfibers and tire particles, a key barrier, as other speakers have already said, is the need for more data and standardized methods. However, as I think Mauro mentioned, you know, the need for further research and for further and for standardized methods should not be a justification to delay intervention. And in that sense, you already have several opportunities to implement action now, especially to exploit by exploiting synergies that exist with other environmental policy objectives. So the example of road traffic and tires has been mentioned. For textiles, another example could be in general to promote sustainable production and consumption practices and to promote the uptake of business models which contribute to the reduction in overall production volumes and the reduction in environmental and climate impacts associated with textiles. And then you also have many tools which can be implemented to make gains in terms of best practices during use. So either through eco-driving, eco-laundering, which, as I said earlier, also bear significant co-benefits with other environmental policy objectives.
Thank you very much, Elena, for your reply. Now seeing that we have Ms. Françoise Bonnet, Secretary General of ACR Plus, joining us as well, I'm very happy to provide a fresh twist in the agenda via providing you also the floor for your key takeaway messages of today's event before we move on with Mr. Bogovič's closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Ilias. I just wanted to say a few words regarding the EPR club that ACR Plus is hosting and has been hosting since several years. And I think refer also directly to Michel Sponar's comment. I would not more than insist that we can learn a lot from what have been already implemented also on waste management and I mean, EPR scheme regarding solid waste management. I think that the EPR club is really the place to be in terms of where we can discuss and put together the different stakeholders of the different value chain and having the possibility to exchange and to understand a little bit the point of view of the different actors and learning from already existing EPR schemes. I think that it's really could be a good inspiration for the future. We are at the beginning with microplastic. We can already tackle them with other systems regarding textiles, tires, but for sure we can learn a lot from experience in other areas. So I just want to make known what we do within the EPR club. It's a unique think tank where we really can discuss among different stakeholders. And I thank you again, EBCD, for the trust in this club. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Françoise, for your remarks. Thanks also to all of our speakers today. Thanks also to our audience. I'm very sorry that we didn't have enough time to address all the questions received. And just to reply to some questions received, we will also follow up in due course next week with a recording of the webinar, but also a full event report produced by the Secretariat of the Intergroup. So last but not least, I'd like to provide the floor back to Mr. Bogovič, hosting MEP of today's discussion, for his closing remarks. Mr. Bogovič, you have the floor.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks also to Françoise and EPR Club that it was possible that I hosted these two great webinars. I think that through these two webinars, we saw all dimension of problems connected with microplastic. and we started from the origins, and we got a lot of informations about textile, about tires, about wastewater treatment. And I think that we agree, we need holistic approach. It's not possible to solve the problem with one separate solution, but we need really a holistic approach. First of all, people, we should change our behavior and respect this first rule, produce less wastes and take care about this. And I think this is the one way. But we also need a lot of knowledge, facts, data, as we saw, as we heard, and to prepare good proposals also on the base of research, on the base of exchange of good practices, and for sure we agree that this EPR principle, polluter pay, is the right principle. We also agree that we need this top-down approach. It means that the European Commission must prepare some regulation and we must follow this. But on another side, we also heard that the industry needs predictability, and Europe is not alone. We are. I'm very happy that today we had also Elena from OECD, and we can hear, like always when we speak about environment, about Paris Agreement, that it's necessary also to look sometimes in the mirror if somebody follow us, and I think it will be one of the also very important thing. As I said, different industry show to us what they did in the last years, and we must agree that we got really a lot of expertise on the base of which it is possible to prepare this solution in line with European vision in Green Deal, circular economy. So we have also some measures how to support this thing. I think very important will be research, and also think about new materials and other things. And I think that we didn't speak a lot about agriculture, but there are a lot of also solutions, also use of plastic films and other things. And I think that here is also the place for this bioeconomy and bio-based products and other things. So that these are also another topics. As I said, here are many new opportunities. And Ilias, you said that I answered in Slovenian language to our colleague Andrej Kržan. Yes, it was very interesting. He invited me in the one company which produce filters to avoid this pollution from textile and other things. And here we are close to these green jobs which are connected with our targets. So I think on one hand we must prepare regulation, but on another hand it's, I think, more important still that the thing will be predictable, and that we have technology with whom we can also follow these trends and ensure that we will have at the end less microplastic around us. So I will conclude also with thanks again to EPR Club that we organized this through. It was honor as chair of bioeconomy working group inside our intergroup climate change, biodiversity, sustainable development, that I was the host of these two excellent webinar. And I think that I can say all in the name in more than 200 participants in previous webinar. Today we had also more than I saw more than 120 of them. Big thanks also, Ilias, to you and Regine. You prepared also and made a great job that these webinars were so great, and thanks. And I think that this intergroup showed how we must work in hand if we want to solve big problems. And here we have big problems, and I'm sure that we will find a solution which will be acceptable for the nature and also for the for the industry and people who depend on our solution on our legislation. Thanks a lot, and I wish you a nice afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bogovič, for perfectly summarizing today's discussions, but also for highlighting the key importance of best practices ahead. On behalf of the European Parliament Intergroup Secretariat, I would also like to wholeheartedly thank all of our speakers and participants who joined us today. Thank you once again, Mr. Bogovič, for taking the lead. While it's been a real pleasure having this online event with you today, specifically focusing on EPR as a solution towards tackling microplastics pollution, we'll also make sure to definitely keep the fire burning via continuing the discussion in the future ahead. So until then, stay safe and all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Elias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.